Welcome to this episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I am your host, Olga Peters, and on the show this week, we have regular contributor, Representative Emily Kornheiser, who's one of 3 state reps for the town of Brattleboro. Hello, Emily.
Good morning, Olga.
And yay, journalist and blogger, John Walters, all the way from central Vermont, Washington County. Glad you can join us this morning, John.
Yes, Washington County, the proud epicenter of the current COVID outbreak.
I was wondering if I should say that. Yes, stay in your house, John. Don't go anywhere this
Don't
week
play
if
hockey.
You don't have to. Yeah, no hockey.
Mm-hmm.
No hockey.
I've been scouring the news reports, seeing if there's any word on exactly why we have such a spike. For those just joining us on Thursday, the report was that the state had a record high 109 cases, new cases that day, and 46 of them were in Washington County. Mm-hmm. And I've been, scouring the reports looking for okay, where are the cases? Who's gotten infected? Why are we so high? And apparently the only answer that anybody has was that the hockey and broomball leagues at that Civic Center in Barrie, over 100, I think the last number I saw was 125 cases tied to that through contact tracing. So
I think there was also a Halloween party.
There was a Halloween party in Marshfield.
Okay.
That apparently was rather sizable and the state officials are very concerned about, and a couple of other events that they know about. Mm-hmm. We're extra concerned up here and hoping that this is just a blip on the radar.
Mm-hmm. And my understanding is that it's not, we had a men's softball league spike down here quite a few months ago. And my understanding is not the actual sporting, but it's the time in the dugout or on the bench or at a party afterwards when people stop wearing their masks.
Right.
And then those people who did not wear their masks then go off and, have social time with trusted people without their masks on. And that is how the spread happens. And it's, it's interesting. When this first started, I was talking to a friend who's from West Virginia. And she said that in West Virginia, there was a phenomenon that we engage in here, but was even more clear to her there, that if you like someone and trust them as a human, then you don't wear a mask with them, right? Mm-hmm. And I saw my mom actually doing something similar to this in New York, that there's some sense of sort of clean people or dirty people or safe people and not safe people that wasn't really related to science. Or the kind of careful conversations that those of us sort of more coming of age through the AIDS epidemic might be aware of, those kinds of conversations, safe sex conversations, that it's more just this visceral loving trust that would cause people to unmask. And that's where so many of our problems are now.
Yeah, and that's going to may be a big problem after Thanksgiving and Christmas. Mm-hmm. When people feel that obligation to gather with their trusted, friends and relatives. Mm-hmm. And that's going to be highly problematic, to say the least. And at this point, we're all so fatigued about it, and we're also worn out by it.
And we can't be outside in the same way. I have a number of friends that I would spend some really good socially distanced outside time with that we're not going to be inside together.
Right. Mm-hmm. And this gets to something that I think we were planning on talking about today, which is Vermont's heavy dependence on the tourism industry.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And the tourism industry is pretty much on hold right now.
Yeah.
And, with this second wave, I don't know how restaurants are going to survive, or, bed and breakfasts or any other sort of tourism related industry is going to go a full year at least, substantially, slashed revenue.
So I want to admit to some xenophobia that I've been having.
Okay.
And that, even when our cases were low, we live in a border town. We border 2 states. We're very close to the New York border too. And, you know, we have a very heavy influx of day tripping tourists, which, you know, further up north, you have longer term tourists, but we even have day tripping tourists. And it's very clear that people weren't quarantining, and the administration was not doing a very thorough job of warning people about quarantining. The highway signs started to be about like taking a nap on the side of the road if you were tired, and they weren't even about masks anymore, let alone like knowing the quarantine map. But, and I was filled with righteous indignation about it all. But very few of the actual cases or case spread in Vermont have anything to do with tourists. They're not happening at restaurants. They're not happening at hotels. They're not, because people are not socializing with for the most part, with people who are coming from out of state, unless those are family members staying in people's houses. And so that's been a bit of cognitive dissonance for me that I just sort of settled into in the last couple of days.
Well, you're much more likely to catch something if you're not only in close proximity to someone, but in close proximity for a substantial period of time.
Without a mask on.
Yeah, and so that's friends and family. That's not, you know, somebody who's driving by you or walking by you on the sidewalk or something like that.
Or even someone that you're serving in a restaurant if, you know, you're coming in and out. So that's sort of an interesting part of the whole thing.
Yeah. Well, COVID is number one on everyone's mind, but we probably ought to get to the things we were planning to talk about today.
Well, so so towards the thing we were talking about today, when we were having conversations about COVID relief funds and talking about how we were going to bail out the restaurant and tourism industry, who had, you know, suffered significant losses. I kept on trying to start conversations about, so this will make sense. We can sort of add parklets and expand outdoor seating. We can subsidize for a little while. What are we going to do when winter comes? When we know we're going to have another surge? We've known that since the beginning. When we're going to have to be inside together, people are less likely to even want to go, even if we expand capacity. What's the plan? And the conversation never went anywhere from there.
Interesting. So I just want to add for folks who maybe aren't part of the tourist industry, I just want to add a little bit of context for how different the conversations around tourism at least might need to be right now than it was when the pandemic started in March. Because Vermont's tourist season tends to be really, especially for like Wilmington and Dover, who are two of our resort towns in the area, tends to be a really busy summer, leaf peeping, and then of course, a really busy ski season. So November, December, January, February, kind of in that area, depending on how the weather works. So when the pandemic first hit and we first had to do all our shelter in place, it was mud season. And so most businesses were at their normal low time of the year, and they're used to that. And so they could kind of adjust. It wasn't easy, but they could do it. Now that, but to do that, they need a busy summer and a busy leaf peeping season and a busy ski season. So we are now heading into what should be a busy ski season. And so that's why, you know, the conversation around businesses, but also around where are people going to be is a little more intense than it was back in March.
I also, when we think about the folks who stopped working during that first shutdown and often have still not been brought back to work, a lot of the smaller restaurants are, you know, the owners are doing much more of the day-to-day work and have kept their staff laid off. We are coming really fairly close to the 12-month mark when unemployment benefits, even extended unemployment benefits, are going to run out. And so that's going to be a really important conversation this legislative session.
Yeah.
And we have no idea what kind of aid packages might come out of Washington.
We do feel more hopeful about that, though.
Well, I think there's more hope that you know, in the transition period, that the Congress will get its act together and put out some sort of an aid package. But you know, how much Republicans will have stomach for that, you know, because Republicans in the Congress are going to suddenly get religion about deficit spending. After, you know, throwing
as they do,
throwing bags of money out the window for the last 4 years. And, you know, it's unclear, you know, how generous a package might be, how much it will be, you know, geared toward businesses and not toward states and local governments. A lot of it's going to depend on those 2 Georgia Senate races in terms of what President-elect Biden will be able to accomplish once he's in office. So, you know, we are, you know, that's where the big money comes from, is the federal government. And that's like a huge unknown over everything that you, Emily, and your cohorts will be trying to figure out once the legislature goes back into session.
And I think what's really going to be important for us is, you know, this first round of funding, people were in such a panic. We didn't have any sense of how long this was going to last, what it would mean, how it was going to shift our economy. I think we could have done a better job thinking and talking about that, but it's very hard to do that when an entire, you know, population is feeling panicked all the time, to have, you know, reasonable conversations. And we were also all learning this new technology and feeling frustrated about it and stuff like that. So what I think will be really important, given that we don't know how many aid packages will come, the next one might be the last one, to really have a conversation about, like, what weaknesses did we see in our state systems as a result of this? Do we say this every week, Olga?
We've been saying this, I think, at least since about March.
So what weaknesses were illuminated from this process that we could take this funding to restructure, strengthen, look at? And for me, one of those is the real challenges with so many folks' employment and livelihood depending on the tourism industry, which is by its very nature seasonal, unstable, sporadic. I think for Chip's staff, and actually for it's can be quite exploitive. That was certainly my experience all the years that I bartended and waitress, and I've done it in more than one tourist location. It's not just my experience in Vermont. So how can we, you know, not, I understand that we don't want to just, you know, shut something down and let it go and say, who cares? Wasn't so great anyway. Too many people will suffer as a result of that. But we could spend this money doing some real transition planning.
Well, and I would add that one of the issues with tourism in Vermont is how much we rely on it. If it was a smaller piece of the economic pie, it might be balanced out in other ways, or the work life of people might look different. But for some areas of our state, it's their mono economy. That's it. And it's such an unstable thing to start with that it's a house of cards for, in my opinion, for economic reasons.
And it's one of those political issues, and John, I'd love your insight on this, that in some ways it seems similar to the Vermont State College challenge, in that you have legislators and communities that are so deeply tied into this institution that having a conversation about the welfare of the entire state, or sort of individuals living within it, becomes very, very hard to do, because there's such an impulse to sort of protect it at all costs. And that can be very powerful. Same
thing with agriculture.
Well, John, before you jump into that, I just want to add to Emily's comment. When we were talking last night, we were talking about natural resources and how tourism is kind of Vermont's natural resource. So if you circle that in, I think listeners would find that interesting as well.
Yeah.
Tall order.
Handle it.
Well, I mean, the dynamics of the House, because each of you represents a small chunk of Vermont, and those are your constituents, and that is supposed to be your primary job, is looking out for your constituents. you do have, a lot of provincialism creeps in. The other thing that I think is highly problematic in this particular time, as COVID has highlighted some of our weaknesses in terms of, economic development, in terms of broadband and housing and, all of that stuff. There's also a mindset in Vermont, and my partner and I moved to Vermont 15 years ago, and we sort of realized immediately that there is a culture in Vermont that in many ways is a good culture, but in some ways is not. And one of the ways in which it is not is that Vermonters and Vermont institutions, large and tiny alike, are very resistant to change of any sort. And you see this quite often in the legislature, and it's not just each person representing their district. It's also just sort of this mindset that what we're doing is fine, and we don't really need to change. And you see that, like, if the House dynamic is 150 people from small chunks of Vermont, the Senate is supposed to be this balancing institution that takes a broader view. And the problem is that, they can take the broader view, but they are also more hidebound and much more resistant to change than I think many members of the House are.
Why do you think that is?
Well, a lot of it is tenure. You have a lot of people who've been in the Senate for a very long time, and the Senate is very proud of its traditions and its ways of doing business. And, you have some of the most senior senators who bring a lot of experience and knowledge to the job, but also are highly invested in how things have been done for, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 years. And, a lot of those people are committee chairs. And one of the things I'm going to be very interested in, when Senator Becca Balint becomes, the head of the Senate, President pro tem, she is very, she's one of my favorite people in the legislature. She is very open-minded, and she takes a really earnest, plain view of the issues we face, of our assets and our deficits and all of that stuff. And she's going to be leading a body that's highly resistant to change. So
what could go wrong?
I think if anybody,
I think she can do it.
If anybody can do it, she can do it.
Because she loves them.
It's going to be a balancing act for her. But that's part of the problem. And the bigger problem overall, not just with the House or the Senate or the executive branch for that matter, is this sort of satisfaction with who we are and how we've always done things. And, we can't be Vermont without, wooden bridges and maple syrup and cows. And, we hold on to things that we rightfully ought to hold on to. And we also hold on to irrelevant things that we would be better off without. And that makes it much harder to take this broad, overall, in-depth look at, like, okay, what does it cost us to be so dependent on tourism, for instance?
Well, so
one of the big questions we face.
I think one of the, I had a conversation with a friend yesterday about how often job creation is considered is talked about as if it was the intended goal, when in fact the intended goal is to make money, right? And job creation is a byproduct of that desire for the owner to make money. And I think in a similar way, we get confused between sort of tourism as a goal versus tourism as a byproduct. And we wind up in a place where, rather than really allowing our agricultural industry to be sort of a subject in our lives, it becomes an object, because it's something that we're sort of selling and viewing, and I'm getting like way too postmodern about this. I'm really sorry, but it's it just becomes another byproduct and a cog in the machine of making money in the tourism industry, which, yes, there are many small businesses, but the bulk of profits in the tourism industry goes to multinational corporations that are out of the state. And so when we talk about sort of what's best for Vermonters, for me, what's best for Vermonters is that the making of the money stays within state and is distributed to as many people as possible through, reasonable wages.
Yeah. Well, I would add to that. I think there's a lot of industries, and tourism being one of them, that deceptively appear like they're making a lot of money. And for an example, I think if you look at the amount of tax money that flows up to the state from the tourist industry, meals, rooms, lodging tax, 1% option tax, all those things, it looks like if you look at that bottom of your line, you're like, wow, tourism generates X amount of money in Vermont. And that's not wrong. But when you dig down to the local level where that money is actually being generated, the outlook's not the same. The bottom lines don't look as big if you look at the people who are like bringing home the wages, for example. And so I think it creates a false sense of abundance.
Or a fear of change because those
Precarious.
revenues, because we're precarious and we feel more precarious, and those are the revenues that we know and we can depend on. And so the opportunity for me in the federal money is almost like it's a safety valve or a life preserver or something that, we can take maybe an opportunity to shift because that tourist money might not be as available. We have this other money available. Maybe that will give us a bit of a launching point for change.
Right.
When I think about what you were saying, John, about these sort of vested interests and challenge to change, the stories that we tell in the State House are very thick and deep and strong for people. And one of the points of the Montpelier Happy Hour is to sort of peel back the curtain a little bit and say, what are these stories? Why do we tell them? How do they inform policy?
Are they real?
Are they real? Yes. I mean, it's all, it's a real story.
It's a real story.
But I have, in order to get something done in government of any kind, but certainly in politics, one needs to stick around for a while because it is a slow moving boulder, and patience and incrementalism is just, that's the way it works. So, however, the longer you stay around, the longer you become subject to those stories, the longer you help write those stories, right? The longer you were the person who made that bad policy decision 5 years ago that you now need to protect into the future, because it's terrible to say you were wrong, right? And it's hard to say you were wrong because you remember the logic that led to that first bad decision. So how do I save myself from that?
And John, we have 5 minutes before the break, so you're on.
I don't know. I mean, part of the problem we have in Vermont is that so many of our legislators, and particularly senators, are in absolutely safe seats and safe districts. And if you have a decent amount of turnover and you have, relatively new people coming up in districts like Emily's, say, for instance, and Sarah Coffey, and, Becca Ballant, for that matter, then there's an influx of new blood, but quite often that is happening much more slowly than would be healthy for the body politic, because so many of our lawmakers really don't face any serious electoral challenge, either within the liberal movement or in the general election. So you wind up with a lot of people who are well-intentioned and good people, but as Emily said, they're invested in how things have been done for a long time. That's not really a problem you can fix. I think what you need to do is you need to have, the younger legislators and the newer legislators, even if they're coming to the body at a more advanced age, um, you know, um, stick together, tell each other their stories so that there are other stories in circulation, and, try to learn your way in the system without being co-opted by the system. Um, and, there are a lot of young or just new lawmakers in Montpelier, or in the virtual Montpelier now in the age of COVID, that I find very heartening and cause for optimism. And, Emily and Becca Ballant are two of those. And, if I thought about it for 10 seconds, I could rattle off a bunch of other names.
You can stop there.
A lot of them are women, and they are not all Democrats or progressives. So there are a lot of good people in the legislature.
Absolutely.
And if we can, like you say, Emily, it's incremental, and that seems especially frustrating at this moment in time where we face so many challenges, and so much of the bad stuff in our foundation has been exposed by COVID. And we are talking we're going back and forth between like the immediate challenges that you're going to face in January, and how we change things in a longer term. And we're going to kind of have to try to do both. And we're going to have to do it with a governor who has very little interest in changing the status quo. Governor Phil Scott talks about the challenges we face, but there's very little evidence that he has any serious intention of, making any sort of major structural change in how we do business, how we spend our money, investing in the kind of transformational stuff that you're talking about, Emily. It's going to be a struggle, and the outcome is probably going to be incremental and unsatisfying to a lot of people.
So when we get back from the break, I would really love to talk about whether Vermont voters gave him a mandate to not change anything.
Yep.
Good question. Yes, the Montpelier Happy Hour will return after we hear from some of our underwriters here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. You can also find us on Emily's YouTube channel, as well as Brattleboro Community Television. So before the break, we were talking a little bit about whether or not voters have given Governor Scott a mandate in voting for him again to not change things. And what I found so interesting about that is, Emily and I have been talking about how COVID can actually be an opportunity, because it's showing the cracks in the system. It's also showing us what we can do. We had, at one point, nobody was homeless in Vermont that we knew of, because we had found housing for people. I think that was unthinkable a few months before.
We had food stamp cards mailed to every single parent of a child under the age of 18.
Yes, perfect. Another example. Thank you, Emily. But, and it also, when I talk to people who work in what we'll call the charitable system, quote unquote, big quotes, whether it's food distribution, whether it's housing, whether it's economics, they're all saying that these systems were originally set up to be emergency safety nets. And yet they are systems that even before COVID, people were relying on for their daily needs, which is just a huge disconnect. And it's a huge sign that something's broken. And yet with COVID, while it can be an opportunity, I still am not hearing a lot of conversations, at least at the state level, that are going that route, that they're like, okay, what have we learned? I know we're still in survival mode, but what have we learned, and what can we start changing so we're stronger when we come out of this? I'll kick that over to John and Emily.
I have an example of that I'd like to throw in and then pass it over to John.
Please do.
So Brattleboro's opiate rate, overdose rate has been going up and up and up for quite a while now, was the highest in the state until the pandemic, which is unlike any other region of the state. And we are, the folks who are really deeply involved in that work are starting to point to the fact that everyone was housed. And they were housed in the context of supportive services, an easy, a regular ride, not Medicaid rides, a different ride to whatever treatment that they were interested in. Regular sort of check-ins and community with each other. Narcan being in everyone's bag that was connected to that housing. And so I think it's a really sort of interesting extra story to tell about the pandemic, that emergency provision of services fixed temporarily two long-standing challenges, and how impactful that is to people's lives, but also how much money that's going to save in the long run, and how much that stabilizes so many other systems of care, from school systems to food systems to medical systems.
Thank you, Emily. That's a great example. John, what are your thoughts? I see you thinking.
Well, I mean, I have heard from other parts of the state that the opiate issue has not gone in such a positive direction. But I don't have figures to back that up, and I may be wrong.
No, you're right.
But it's, that's one whole level of, I mean, how many more people are going to be homeless or on the brink of homelessness, with the least little gust of wind going to tip them over, as we head through this winter with part of our economy basically shut down, and unemployment benefits running out, and rent protection can't last forever. Our charitable systems are going to be under huge strain, and one of the challenges for Emily and her colleagues is going to be balancing whatever money we get from the feds is balancing immediate relief for troubled businesses and other institutions with boosting our social services charitable system, and then also pivoting to the longer term. How do we start fixing things in a fundamental way so that we are stronger coming out of this than we were going into it? That's like a three-part challenge, and I do not envy any state lawmaker for what they're going to face when they get back to virtual Montpelier in January.
No, and an interesting dynamic of it is, the legislature is the one who hypothetically makes those decisions, but the administration of those funds sits in the administration.
Yes.
And so an interesting place that we see this playing out is the Joint Fiscal Committee is meeting tomorrow. Today's Friday, tomorrow's Saturday. Yes, they're meeting tomorrow, actually, to discuss what to do with some funds that were not spent, that were allocated in one place. And the administration says they won't be able to sort of keep in that allocation because they weren't able to spend it fast enough. And so
it has to be spent by the end of the year.
And it has to be spent actually like a week before the end of the year, bizarrely. So, and that's federal guidelines for the money. Just, it's not like some arbitrary deadline that someone set. It's an arbitrary deadline that the Fed set. For
whatever
really
reason.
Makes everything much more complicated. But what that sort of illuminates for me, and then the administration is saying we need to send this to business relief because it's the fastest way we have of getting money out. That's one of the talking points about why it's best to spend down these millions of dollars through business relief than to humans, because it's easier to get the money out the door for businesses. the reason it's easier to get the money out for businesses than it is to even the nonprofits who I think this money was originally supposed to go to. And I know that the Domestic Violence Network and the Parent-Child Centers and a few other sort of conglomerations of community-based organizations that I know about had tremendous problems getting the money that was allocated to them from the administration. Paperwork, paperwork, paperwork. So why are we putting so, and this is not what happens in law, this happens in administration. Why is it so much harder for a community-based organization to get money than for businesses to get money? Why is it so much harder for people to get money than for businesses to get money? You know, like why can't, so businesses just, you know, it's their tax return, like it's the tax department that decides all of this. If the tax department decided state benefits, and if like anyone sort of making below a certain threshold when the taxes were filed just got like shot into the food stamp system and the Medicaid system, one, people's lives would be like so much easier, but we would spend less money on administration. Those benefits would go to people who needed it. And so the administration makes these very conscious decisions about who they trust and who they don't trust.
Right.
Very conscious decisions about where the money is sort of more deserving and not deserving that can really usurp legislative intention quite easily.
Well, and again, I think what you're touching on is, again, the stories we're telling. Businesses will use money well. People will waste it, for example.
And I don't think anyone's saying, like anyone's sitting in, I mean, maybe, but I'm assuming best intentions. I don't think anyone's sitting in the governor's office and like saying these things out loud, or sitting in the, you know, any of the state departments and saying these things out loud. I think they're just.
But often our stories aren't out loud.
No, they're not.
Yeah.
And now we're at a point where the money has to get spent so fast that creative thinking becomes that much harder because there's, you know, intense pressure.
Yeah. And there is that, I mean, there's a narrative that, you know, the undeserving poor and, you know, the undeserving workers who, you know, there was all that panic in the summertime, which is still simmering out there about, you know, if any person gets more in unemployment than they were making on their job, then they won't have any incentive to go back to work. So we have to punish them for being out of work, even though it's because of a pandemic. There's also a disconnect where like money that goes into a business is assumed to create economic, you know, results. It goes into the economy. It does productive things.
It trickles down.
Yeah, but there's no similar awareness of the fact that if you give a poor person, you know, a stimulus check, that money goes into the economy too. In fact, quite often it goes more directly and more impactfully into the economy because those people are needing to spend the money right away. And, you know, the similar thing with social services, that's sort of considered to be, you know, a crutch for people who need it. Instead of, it is a support for people who need it, but it's also economic stimulus because every dollar the government puts out there goes into the economy. And
it stabilizes our entire community. When a household is stable, it stabilizes the community, which stabilizes the state. And I don't want to imply that I don't think that like businesses are like, I know businesses are significantly struggling and people are scared and money is needed for that too. It's just stepping back enough to get perspective that I think is really important.
And I would say it's also kind of like what we were talking about with tourism. It's about balance. You know, if the money's going all to businesses and not making it to households, that's imbalanced. If it's going all to households and not making it to other businesses, that can be an imbalance as well. And I think there just are a lot of imbalances. Our systems are lopsided in so many ways.
And there were a lot of, you know, challenges with the way the paycheck protection money was administered. But the phenomenon of putting in sort of a safeguard with funds to say this must be used in a way that will disperse it rather than in a way that it will sort of be held by one individual is really important. There's also something interesting that's been coming up in the joint, sort of in the aftermath of our original decisions, that the hazard pay program was, rather than having individuals apply for the hazard pay, or to look, say, at the tax department or the Department of Labor, who has labor history information for everyone who's paid in Vermont, we asked employers to apply for hazard pay for their employees.
Right.
And there are a number of major employers in the state who are saying, no, we're not going to bother. Grocery stores, Walmart, I think maybe Staples. And it's really, I think it's surprising to a lot of us that businesses wouldn't, of course, want more money for the folks who worked there. And that wasn't just sort of the easiest way to administer money.
To make sure it got to as many people as possible. Mm-hmm. Yeah. John, what are your thoughts on this? What are you seeing?
Well, there's one thing that I would like to get to that we've touched on a little bit here and there, but address it directly, is that a lot of thought was sparked in my mind by a tweet that Emily put out earlier. That actually, it's a couple of weeks ago now, and I have it on my phone and I can read it to you. Can we finally take a minute or a year to re-examine our dependence on tourism and imagine a new economic future for our community? One with living wages, seasonal stability, and a housing market that's for all of us. And we've talked about tourism, but how I'd really be interested in hearing Emily's thoughts on how we do imagine that new, more stable, more productive for all of us economic future. What would you like to see happen again when you go back to work in January? Not that you're not working now.
I'm working so much now, John. It's ridiculous. And I am not, we really only get paid those months of the session. It's for the whole thing is just like wild nonsense.
Yeah.
But I also want to make sure our listeners don't get so excited about my Twitter feed, because it's very sporadic. So if you're like, wow, that was a great tweet, I want to jump on Twitter, follow Emily. Like, sometimes it's good, most of the time I don't find my way there. So, but
disclaimer.
It's fun. It's fun when it happens. I've always think of Twitter as like the vibe of like sitting in a dive bar in my late 20s with like 2 bourbons in. Like, that attitude is the attitude you need to thrive on Twitter. And I'm not often able to conjure up that attitude these days, because there are no dive bars or bourbon in my life.
And then you get in that mindset, and then annoying people on Twitter fact check you.
Oh,
that has not happened to me yet.
Anyway, we're getting off track.
Sorry, I will come back.
The Twitterverse.
Yes.
What do you want to happen in January that will start us on that path?
Yes. Also, before I do that, while we're on disclaimers, the views and opinions expressed on the show are those of the hosts and the guests, and not the radio station or the TV station or the YouTube channel.
Or House Caucus leadership.
Or House Caucus leadership, whoever that may be.
Yes.
So I think housing is a nice place to start. Our housing market is really, really, really challenging here in Southeast Vermont. Yeah. In some ways, it's very similar to Chittenden County in terms of having incredibly low vacancy rates. Yeah. And
that's putting it nicely.
That's putting it very nicely. And those low vacancy rates create a number of situations. One of them is that super subpar housing is still desirable. And so there's very little incentive to fix it up. It also creates a challenge around the conditions, the sort of social conditions that people are willing to experience in a housing unit. I think that's a real problem in the Brattleboro area. And we see issues of trafficking related to people trying to maintain their housing. And I don't know, trafficking isn't always like, folks from somewhere overseas in a shipping container huddled together,
Yeah.
or like hiding in the back of a pizza joint in Virginia, or like whatever that weird thing from the last election cycle was. It trafficking means someone being coerced into using their body to obtain something, often housing or substances, but other things too. So it's just a really important part of the housing market that people don't talk about enough. So I try to use every opportunity I can. So, and then there's the fact that our really challenging housing market means that people who might want to live here can't live here or can't move here for the jobs that are often available, to create sort of a much more diverse community that can thrive. And so when I think about ways of fixing that, a lot of it is just straight up investment in housing. So if we create more affordable housing in terms of sort of the category of affordable housing, that's public-private partnerships, there are housing and land trusts, that's a real opportunity to fix up decaying housing stock. It's a real opportunity for people to have the stability to know that their incomes are going to match their housing. And that's really, really important. There's also the zoning work that needs to be done in many of our communities so that less expensive housing can be created, or more housing in smaller units can be created. So we have a lot of folks who are living in a 4-bedroom house, but their kids are gone, who aren't moving into a smaller unit because there's nothing available.
Right.
And so creating space in any sort of place in the great flow of housing, because our housing market is so incredibly scarce, would have an impact across the whole system, which I don't think that's necessarily true in most places. I think that's really only true in places with the incredible deficit that we have here. So,
and I would add as well, we've heard Chris Campany at the Wyndham Regional Commission talk about this, that if we're to have additional housing, especially outside towns that have municipal water systems, we need more infrastructure to support more housing in some of these villages in the way of sewer and wastewater and potable water, drinking water.
And so infrastructure investments are really real. So it's social infrastructure investments like, childcare and family medical leave, but it's also physical infrastructure like internet and cell phone service and water. And so making investments in those things have such significant ripple effects into people's ability to maintain employment and to move into new areas of employment. If someone has stable, affordable childcare, they have a much greater chance of being able to go back to school while they're working. They have a much greater chance of being able to really focus on their work towards promotion, to make sort of much more strategic decisions about where they work and where they don't work and what kind of pay that they're going to have there. And housing really, safe housing and safe childcare really create that landing space for families, and especially for single mothers, of which we talk about all the time, but do very little about. And that's a large portion of the families that we're talking about. And that's how people have families now. It's not an anomaly. It's not 1942. And so that's the family unit. And so we need to make systems that support that family unit, not this other mythic family unit. So those are two big places of investment that I see that have fairly immediate ripple effects into other parts of the economy, in addition to sort of the construction jobs. When we talk about a Green New Deal in Vermont, it sounds like super floofy. But what it means is investing in infrastructure that's required to be resilient in the face of climate change, and people having jobs building that infrastructure. It's not carbon taxes. It's not radical politics. It's like building sewers and building insulated houses and having people get paid to build those things. So for me, those are really important priorities for the biennium. And and then a place that some of that revenue can come from is when we think about COVID refugees, when we think about the tourist economy, when we think about our housing challenges, we have a huge number of large, fancy, we have a huge number of large houses that someone from and of Vermont likely wouldn't want to buy because they require like another $100,000 worth of work to insulate or heat.
Yeah.
Those are second homes, they're third homes. I mean, we shouldn't even call them second homes. They are vacation homes, or homes that have become people's homes now. We've seen this huge increase in the number of houses, the price of houses in the last few months. And so there are a number of ways we can restructure our revenues to make the most of that situation, which causes challenges for the rest of our housing system, but is a real opportunity for revenues. And some of that stuff is super geeky. So I am stopping now. Thank you, Olga.
It's beautifully geeky, but we don't have much time left, and I want to make sure we hear from John.
We would be, that's something I've thought about too, is that, that's a clearly a place where there is economic growth that is a legitimate source of revenue for the things we want to do in the public sector. And we would be targeting, people who can afford a second home, a fairly expensive second home, and a lot of them are out of staters. So it's like, the best kind of tax.
What I think is really important, though, is that we're not creating a dependency on that, because then we create an incentive to not have, to have housing for other people rather than housing for folks here. So it's, in some ways, it's like a tobacco tax or a liquor tax that you've incentivized the system towards bad behavior.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's true. I mean, I think some of this might be like what, the late lamented David Zuckerman talked about in his campaign, a temporary wealth tax. It's, he didn't really die.
No, he did not.
But he talked about a temporary wealth tax because, the rich people have gotten a significant, boost from the Trump tax cuts. And, now we got these people who are coming in here and buying expensive homes and not living in them, which is another drag on the economy, by the way. If you have a lot of homes that are vacant most of the time, those people are not like, going to restaurants and going to grocery stores and all that. But that's another issue entirely.
So Zuckerman's temporary wealth tax, I think the first time Vermont implemented that, it was called the Snelling surcharge, and it was under a Republican administration during a recession. And so I want to make sure that we keep that idea tied to a recession and a Republican administration and some pretty broad consensus, rather than, as you said, the late lamented Lieutenant Governor Zuckerman.
Yes, that's true. And just, the political center of gravity seems to have shifted away from that idea, because now, Governor Scott is clearly going to be against any sort of any revenue enhancement, however you define that. And there seems to be very little appetite in the legislature and the Democratic caucuses for any sort of, boost in revenue from whatever source we could come up with.
I don't know if that's true, John.
Okay.
Ooh, are they're fighting words here?
I don't, not fighting words, but I would say that, certainly there's a tendency to not talk about things like that during an election season, unless.
Yeah.
But I think there's a number of people who understand both the reality of the situation with regards to our revenues and the fact that pretty much any economist that's come before any of the fiscal committees has said, you need to look at revenues, and that will actually help your economy.
Well, it's been known for quite some time that our tax and revenue systems are out of whack with the current reality of the economy in a lot of ways. And there's been a lot of resistance to, reforming our tax system, because everybody's afraid that they will be the ones who lose out. But yeah, I mean, there does need to be a restructuring of how we collect tax revenues. And, the other point about Lieutenant Governor Zuckerman's proposal is that it was meant to be a temporary thing, with the revenue going into these kind of investments that, Emily, you're talking about in housing and weatherization efficiency and broadband, and, you know, jumpstarting the green economy so that more of our energy dollars stay right here in Vermont.
Mhm.
And that's something we can do without addressing the underlying system, is create some sort of like temporary pool of revenue that we can tap into to jumpstart Vermont's economic future.
Mhm.
We are unfortunately out of time. Such a pleasure having you on the show, John. It's always great to have you join the conversation. Before we head out, remind people where they can read your blog.
Well, it's called the Vermont Political Observer, and the website is just thevpo.org. But if you search the VPO on Google, you will get me and the Vienna Philharmonic.
Both good places to land.
Yeah.
If you search for, that's why my Twitter handle is the VPO1, the number 1, because the VPO is the Vienna Philharmonic Twitter account. But, you know, if you just search for the Vermont Political Observer, you'll find me. So that's where you can find my writing. And, you know, one thing that I'm planning to write about in the near future, maybe even today, is looking at some of the structural problems and what I would call the complacency of the Vermont Democratic Party. So
yeah,
that should be good to offend a few people.
Can't wait.
So look for that. The newest post on there is actually a Veterans Day / Armistice Day post about my grandfather-in-law, who died in 1918 in northern France during World War I. Many years ago now, I did a really intensive historical deep dive into like learning as much as I could about his story. And it was just an amazing story. And I wrote an abridged version of it on my blog. And that's the current newest post. It had nothing to do with Vermont politics, but you know, it's my blog, so I'll cry if I want to.
exactly.
So anyway, that's where you can find me.
Thank you, John. And Emily, where can folks find you?
And I want to say thank you, John. Whenever I feel wounded by one of your blog posts, I know that you've hit on something I should pay attention to. So you can find me at emilykornheiser.org, where you can find your way from there to my mediocre Twitter feed, my very consistent Facebook feed, or my even more sporadic Instagram feed, because pictures from inside my house aren't very interesting to anyone. And you can also find my email address there, my phone number, and you can find a link to my weekly community coffee hour every Saturday, 10 a.m. via the Zoom. So start at the website and travel from there.
So before we head out, I just want to toast to the great conversation. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, John. And to the power of stories, how they can unite us on so many levels, but how we also need to be honest with them and take them out and brush them off from time to time and see, is this still the story we want to tell? This is the Montpelier Happy Hour on WVEW. Everyone have a great weekend.